Hello, and welcome back to my Making a TTRPG from Scratch series. Today we will be focusing on refining the combat that was set up in the previous one. If you haven't watched it, please go back and do so you'll be familiar with what we've worked on so far. I've gone ahead and cleaned up some of the text here. I didn't add anything new, so don't worry that you've missed anything. Just made it a lot easier to look at. As you can see, so far the combat really just describes the clash part of the system, whereas I was thinking there has to be a little bit more to it and you have to consider what prompts the clash, and I want everyone to be able to have multiple options in combat at all times. One major problem I find with D&D is that people can only really make things happen during their turn. You can react to things occurring to you mostly, or around you, but other than that, it's pretty limited. So I want a more reaction-heavy combat style, so I'm going to give everyone 2 reactions between each of their turns. However, clashing with an opponent will cost one of these reactions. So if you want to be able to potentially completely mitigate or turn combat back on the opponent, you have to spend one of your reactions to do so. Also, there are situations where you might not be capable of clashing with them per se. For example, if they were to, in the Naruto context, use a giant fireball jutsu and you don't have any sort of chakra or jutsu or the hand seal sign to create something that could cancel that out at all, well then your only option would be to attempt to dodge it or block it with your body. And that's going to be similar to saving rolls in this case, but I'm going to make it a lot more of a blanket thing where you pretty much use the same stats and you just try to reduce the damage, but you're still going to take a good chunk of it. However, there is one major flaw I've found, or at least thought about. A lot of my process comes down to imagining what it feels like to be a player in this situation, and I can't imagine I would be very satisfied if I have like an S rank in taijutsu and I roll a d20 and my opponent has a D rank, but then I still lose. If I roll a 1 and they roll a 2, then it doesn't matter how good my chances were. Sure, that might work in a TTRPG context, but it's hard to really imagine how that plays out if you're supposed to be an expert at combat and they're not very good. So I want to be able to mitigate the chances of that kind of stuff happening. One way I figured out to do this is, since a lot of the times you work in squads of 3 in Naruto, someone's going to be there to help you out. So I have new reactions: assist and distract. Distract, you use one of your reactions to cause the enemy to have to reroll their die. So if they roll really well, you can mitigate that, hopefully. And assist, you do have to be able to justify it a little, but if you help out your ally with their technique or whatever they're doing, then they can reroll their die if they rolled really low some reason. We can even obviously play that out with justification from the DM, but that's just how it normally is in all of these TTRPGs. Then lastly, I mentioned last time that there will be jutsu where if they're too high rank, you might take multiple turns to cast them completely, but that doesn't work out very well with the idea that you are supposed to have fast-paced combat. If it takes multiple turns to do something, then it's really not going to be worth doing at all. So instead of that, I was thinking you could consume a reaction or 2 to help prepare that attack. And I want you to be able to anticipate things well and be rewarded for being creative and strategic. So maybe you prepare something and then another time when you'd be able to react to something, you can use that thing you prepared in advance, maybe as part of a team attack or something like that, to set up something really awesome. So with all that, I was thinking I can put this under a blanket reaction called prepare, where you spend that reaction and then you have to put what you're doing face down to prove that you had the intention all along, but then you can prepare it for later. Well, I do think these additions all really help in making the combat feel a lot better, and everyone gets to feel active during it, but to still feel like they have their time to shine as well. I am still a little worried about RNG, low rolls, high rolls, really getting in the way of what feels like it should be. So For players that really wouldn't enjoy that sort of thing, I'm considering changing the size of the dice. But I am a big fan of this concept. I think that's something that I would do in playtesting more so, to really decide if it's more fun to have a big range of numbers and you could get any one of them, or to have multiple die for one stat. For example, if you have 2d6 against 1d6, you're probably never going to lose because of the way the odds work out with that. Or at the very least, it's a lot less likely. Of course, you may have noticed that right now it's set up so if you ever roll multiple dice, you take the average. The idea for that was more so if you're using a technique that combines two different things, like you're using a sword and taijutsu at the same time, then you roll 2 dice and you take the average between them. If I make the system so that you're rolling multiple dice, I would need to change that line to say if you ever roll using multiple stats or something like that. It's another reason I'm hesitant to do it. It adds complexity to the game, and that isn't necessarily a good thing in this case. I feel like the only reason being to mitigate RNG kind of makes it not worth it for newer players, but more worth it for hardcore players. So I might factor it in as an optional rule or something like that. And just because I'm more comfortable with it, I feel like I'm going to have the combat take place on a grid. Just using a grid-based combat system with 5 feet for each square definitely comes easier to me. I can imagine it. Everyone gets to see what they're looking at, how far away enemies are. So that's the system I'm going to go with. Now, even with all this done, and this being pretty much all we're going to do for the system itself, having combat, it might not feel very fulfilled, but in my opinion, a lot of the meat of combat comes from the techniques themselves, because they can have as much information as they need. You can say, oh, you can only activate this in this situation, this is what it does, this is how it's going to affect everything. And the stats are also such a huge part of combat, so I think that's pretty much all we need for the clash system itself. Moving down to the Naruto clash specifically, then we can start thinking a little more about what else we need to alter how specific things interact. Like, for example, I want you to be able to have a clash with taijutsu where you are trying to sneak in special moves or move your opponent around during it, but it's going to be different if you're just shooting a giant stream of fire and they're shooting a giant stream of water. Presumably, one just wins out, and then that's going to completely change the way that you interact with the clash system. But that's something probably specific to Naruto. I'm sure there's other media you could use a similar system, but I don't want the clash system itself to try and differentiate between these things. Genjutsu, of course, is pretty different in this regard. I know the main way that ninja tend to go against Genjutsu is to cast Release, which is all about chakra control. We do already have a stat for that, so for the most part, I think it's just going to be a deal of, hey, can you release from this? Do you have strong enough focus? Because, for example, Sakura was a character that was highly valued in the early seasons for being able to get herself out of Genjutsu that may have completely taken out a better fighter like Naruto. There's a lot else to be said about Sakura, but for the most part, it's nice to have a well-rounded party, so in these situations you don't get party wiped by a really strong Genjutsu. I like the idea of moves like that when they hit you pretty hard. It's a completely different style of fighting than just shooting giant element blasts at the enemy. Obviously, that's something very specific to Naruto, and it's not going to be used in the general system. Another thing that is strongly associated with ninjas, and probably more specific to Naruto, is how important of a role stealth plays. I want you to be able to make stealthy attacks to try to sense your enemy to know if you're being watched and stuff. Obviously, this stuff can be important in D&D a lot, but in a more action-based game, like Clash System usually is meant to be, it might play less of a role, but for Naruto, it has to be important, even in the combat. So, I think a very powerful way to use it would be an attack from stealth you can't react to it. Reactions are such an important part of this system, so completely taking away the ability to spend your reaction on something, obviously that's going to be very powerful. But just as important in the Naruto world is the ability not to get snuck up on. So I think I'll be adding a few more stats that cover for this specific instance. A stealth stat and a perception stat. Obviously, there are characters that specialize in this kind of stuff. A great example being anyone with Byakugan or Sharingan, the visual dojutsu, whose whole goal is to perceive the opponent from all sides and never get caught off guard. So with that in mind, I do think it's a stat worth having. Thinking about what else there is to potentially add in a secondary stat section, I like the idea of a strategy stat, because Shikamaru, one of Kishimoto's favorite characters for sure, is basically a character that works entirely on strategy. So gives players another options of some character for fantasy to fulfill and play into, and will allow them to probably focus more on helping their teammates out in combat, directing them, things like that. Actually, that works great with the next thing I was just thinking about, which is the initiative system, which I also think should be specific to each thing. It makes sense to use strategy and potentially perception together to come up with, hey, when are you going to notice the enemy or be able to act right away? That lines up pretty well with those stats and gives them a real purpose that people can immediately see if they invest in them, regardless of what skills they have or don't have. One great way of buffing an ability that you think isn't particularly strong compared to other ones, but you still want in the game, is always to consider what systems doesn't it interact with right now, or what do I still need to implement that it could potentially be used for. And then with that, it's just another easy way, as long as it makes sense to you in some way or another, to make that feel a lot more impactful and make people want to invest in it right away. 'Cause it never feels good to invest in a stat for a character fantasy if it doesn't feel like it has any initial payoff. That's actually a very common issue in D&D for sure. There are a lot of stats that are considered dump stats because not necessarily you don't want a character that has those qualities, but you know, I'm not going to get much use out of this if I put into it right away. It's important to have things balanced, but it's more important to make people feel like, oh, don't have to feel bad when I invest in this. Because typically, everything will feel okay when you're playing out the game for the most part, unless it's egregiously unbalanced. But you want to be able to tell them up front, hey, you put points in this, you're going to get this out of it. You can reliably do so. At this point, I have a pretty strong idea of how I want the combat to look and act. I think the next thing that needs to really be done is being a little bit more specific in my dialogue with the clash system, specifically how it interacts with different types of combat. So I'm going to go up and clean this up a little. I did mention in the system notes that the actions could be queued, etc., but then when I go down here, I say, hey, whichever jutsu is bigger wins. So if that's the case, I need to move this here or rework it a little so that specifically the system remains mostly the same, but when doing specifically the clash combat in Naruto, the rules are more clear about when you do what type of behavior. And with that mostly done, and it's definitely going to need a little more cleaning up again, but from here on out, I think the most important thing to move on to is probably to start making character sheets and do character creation. So we'll be featuring that next time. Thanks for watching, and since this is part 2, I'm going to do the normal YouTuber stuff now, and ask you to like and subscribe. It really helps, blah, blah, blah. And with that said, please tune in for part 3. Bye, B.